to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today's chapter is 1 Kings chapter 20. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, gathered all his army together. 32 kings were with him in horses and chariots, and he went up and closed in on Samaria and fought against it. And he sent his messengers into the city to Ahab, king of Israel, and said to him, Thus says Ben-Hadad, Your silver and your gold are mine, your best wives and children are also mine. And the king of Israel answered, As you say, my lord, O king, I am yours and all that I have. The messengers came again and said, Thus says Ben-Hadad, I sent to you, saying, Deliver to me your silver and your gold, your wives and your children. Nevertheless, I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house and the houses of your servants, and lay hands on whatever pleases you, and take it away. Then the king of Israel called all the elders of the land, and said, Mark now, and see how this man is seeking trouble. For he sent to me for my wives and my children, and for my silver and my gold, and I did not refuse him. And all the elders and all the people said to him, Do not listen or consent. So he said to the messengers of Ben-Hadad, Tell my lord the king all that you first demanded of your servant I will do, but this thing I cannot do. And the messengers departed and brought him word again. Ben-Hadad sent to him and said, The gods do so to me, and more also, if the dust of Samaria shall suffice for handfuls of all the people who follow me. The king of Israel answered, Tell him, Let not him who straps on his armor boast himself as he who takes it off. When Ben-Hadad heard this message as he was drinking with the kings in the booths, he said to his men, Take your positions. And they took their positions against the city. And behold, a prophet came near to Ahab, king of Israel, and said, Thus says Yahweh, Have you seen all this great multitude? Behold, I will give it into your hand this day, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And Ahab said, By whom? He said, Thus says Yahweh, by the servants of the governors of the districts. Then he said, Who shall begin the battle? He answered, You. Then he mustered the servants of the governors of the districts, and they were 232. And after them he mustered all the people of Israel 7,000. And they went out at noon. While Ben-Hadad was drinking himself drunk in the booths, he and the 32 kings who helped him. The servants of the governors of the district went out first, and Ben-Hadad sent out scouts, and they reported to him, Men are coming out from Samaria. He said, If they have come out for peace, take them alive, or if they have come out for war, take them alive. So these men went out of the city, and the servants of the governors of the districts, and the army that had followed them, and each struck down his man. The Syrians fled, and Israel pursued them, but Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, escaped on a horse with horsemen. And the king of Israel went out and struck the horses and chariots, and struck the Syrians with a great blow. Then the prophet came near to the king of Israel, and said to him, Come, strengthen yourself, and consider well what you have to do, for in the spring the king of Syria will come up against you. And the servants of the king said to him, Their gods are gods of the hills, and so they were stronger than we. But let us fight against them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they. And do this, remove the kings each from his post, and put commanders in their places, and muster an army like the army that you have lost, horse for horse, and chariot for chariot. Then we will fight against them in the plain, and surely we shall be stronger than they. And he listened to their voice and did so. In the spring Ben-Hadad mustered the Syrians and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. And the people of Israel were mustered and were provisioned and went against them. The people of Israel encamped before them like 2 little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. And a man of God came near and said to the king of Israel, Thus says Yahweh, because the Syrians have said that Yahweh is a God of the hills, but he is not a God of the valleys. Therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And they encamped opposite one another 7 days. Then on the 7th day the battle was joined, and the people of Israel struck down of the Syrians 100,000 foot soldiers in 1 day, and the rest fled into the city of Aphek, and the wall fell upon 27,000 men who were left. Ben-Hadad also fled and entered an inner chamber in the city, And his servants said to him, Behold, now we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings. Let us put sackcloth around our waist and ropes on our head and go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he will spare your life. So they tied sackcloth around their waists and put ropes on their heads and went to the king of Israel and said, Your servant Ben-Hadad says, Please, let me live. And he said, Does he still live? He is my brother. Now the men were watching for a sign, and they quickly took it up from him and said, Yes, your brother Ben-Hadad. Then he said, Go and bring him. Then Ben-Hadad came out to him, and he caused him to come up into the chariot. And Ben-Hadad said to him, The cities that my father took from your father I will restore, and you may establish bazaars for yourself in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria. And Ahab said, I will let you go on these terms. So he made a covenant with him, and let him go. And a certain man of the sons of the prophets said to his fellow at the command of Yahweh, Strike me, please. But the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, Because you have not obeyed the voice of Yahweh, behold, as soon as you have gone from me, a lion shall strike you down. And as soon as he had departed from him, a lion met him and struck him down. Then he found another man and said, Strike me, please. And the man struck him, and wounded him. So the prophet departed and waited for the king by the way, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. And as the king passed, he cried to the king and said, Your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and behold, a soldier turned and brought a man to me and said, Guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver. And as your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. The king of Israel said to him, So shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. Then he hurried to take the bandage away from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And he said to him, Thus says Yahweh, Because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And the king of Israel went to his house vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria. This is the word of the Lord. Our text today really is an interesting one, as Ahab has already been described to us a couple of chapters back. We had a break as we learned a little bit about Elijah. But Ahab was described to us as being a very wicked king who was more wicked than the fathers that were before him, and that he led the people of Israel astray. And yet we actually see bits and pieces of faithfulness from Ahab in this chapter. Unfortunately, it ends in the wrong direction. It ends in unfaithfulness rather than in faithfulness. So we start with Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, off to the northeast, bringing 32 kings with him. So this is a large group of different tribes, and they have marched against Samaria, the capital city of Ahab, to fight against God's people in Israel. Remember, Israel's the faithless northern kingdom. So Ben-Hadad starts the aggression by simply sending messengers who claim that everything that belongs to the king of Israel is his. Your silver, your gold, so your precious metals that are valuable, your best wives and children also. So polygamy's in play there, but Ben-Hadad is taking Ahab's wives and children. And the king of Israel responds, Okay, I am yours and all that I have. He's willing to part with these things in order to be, in his mind, left alone. You could try to make a New Testament claim to this. You know, as Jesus said, if someone asks you for your cloak, give him your tunic also, or something like that. If they ask you, if the Roman soldiers compel you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. But Ahab is not under that instruction from Jesus at this point, because he is the authority figure. He is the one whom God has granted the authority over his people. So Ahab ought to have, as he should throughout this whole thing, ought to have turned to God instead of simply making the request to the king of Syria, well, instead of simply giving in to it. You can talk to your children here about this in verse 4. Why did Ahab give in? Can you imagine somebody coming up to you and saying, give me all your stuff, and you just give it to them? Again, as Christians, we're actually, in a sense, called to do that by Jesus. None of this earthly stuff that we have matters. Now, we might hold our family in a very different regard, and that's a different conversation. But, yeah, if somebody comes up to me and asks me for my coat because they need it, I give it to them. That's the way we're taught by the New Testament to live. But this isn't enough for Ben-Hadad. He then comes back against Ahab and says that he's going to come and take away anything of Ahab's that is pleasing to Ahab. And for some reason, this is what aggravates him. Like, this is what pushes Ahab over the edge. Now, in fairness, it's not just Ahab this time, but also they're going to search the houses of Ahab's servants. So this is a plundering of the people of Israel that we're now talking about. And so Ahab calls together the elders. He lays out the situation before him, and their instruction to him is not to do this thing. And so we've got war coming. Ben-Hadad's response is to swear to all of his false gods that the dust of Samaria will have to suffice for his soldiers and for his people. That's a threat, if you didn't catch it. The destruction of Samaria is what will result in the dust of Samaria. So Ben-Hadad is going to crush Ahab and his people. That's the threat. Ahab's response is actually a very wise saying when you think about it, and other cultures have had this proverb or a similar one to it. Let not him who straps on his armor, so the one who's preparing to go to battle, boast himself as he who takes it off, so the one who's done with battle. I think our phrase that we have today is don't count your chickens before they're hatched. Ben-Hadad is boasting as though he's already won the day, that he's already won the fight, and the fight hasn't begun. So Ahab is warning him against that, but Ben-Hadad does not listen, seeks the battle anyway. Take your positions, he tells his soldiers. And then when we come back to him in verse 16, we actually see him already celebrating. He and the other 32 kings have gotten themselves drunk ahead of the battle instead of after it. Not that it's right to do it after anyway, but they're boasting, they're celebrating, they're prideful before this fight is even over. It hasn't even started. God sends a prophet in the meantime to Ahab. And the purpose statement is going to be in there at the end of verse 13. You shall know that I am Yahweh. God is seeking to bring Ahab to repentance, seeking to bring him back into the fold, into the faithfulness that the Lord expects from his people. And so he's going to give this entire multitude, this people of Syria, into Ahab's hand. All this great multitude is going to be delivered over to Ahab for God's judgment to take place upon Syria. God is in control of all things. So God is over Syria just as much as he is over Israel. He is just as much their God as the other. They don't realize it. Syria doesn't trust in God or believe in him. They have their own, but their own gods are false. The God of Israel is the God of all creation, and he is just in delivering his judgment upon faithless people whenever he chooses to do so. But at this moment, he's also, double purpose. He's bringing that judgment on Syria, but in the intent of bringing, again, the repentance about an Ahab. Ahab listens. He engages the prophet. He asks who's going to do the battle. He asks if he should wait for Ben-Hadad to come to him or if he should instigate the fight himself. And it's interesting. Ahab is faithless. He's wicked. But here he's heeding the words of the prophet. And he does it again later in the chapter, right? The response of the prophet at the very end of the chapter worries Ahab. It hits him. The law hits Ahab. He's listened before as well. After Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, You almost see a softening of Ahab there. Anyway, as we continue on, the battle takes place very quickly, verses 19 and 20, and Ahab's governors, the servants, strike down the Syrians so that the Syrians flee. Ben-Hadad gets away on a horse. The prophet, the same one as before, comes to Ahab again and tells him that in the spring this is all going to happen again. They're going to fight Syria in the spring too. That's where we get what's happening over in Syria with Ben-Hadad's servants encouraging him to go fight again. And you can talk about their statement with your kids. Their gods are gods of the hills, and so they were stronger than we. What are they arguing? And is it true? They're arguing Israel has multiple gods, for one, which is false but true at the same time. It's false in the sense that there's only one real God, but it's true when you look at it from the perspective that Israel has all those false idols that they worship. And so the servants are saying that Israel's gods fight in the hills. So if we take the battle to the plains, they don't have their advantage anymore. Their gods can't fight for them, so we can overcome them. That's the argumentation. Is it true? No. Yahweh is the God of the hills, but he's the God of the valleys also, of the plains. And we're going to see God himself respond in that way in just a little bit. So as you come down to the next section in verse 26, there are multiple cities by the name of Aphek, so it's hard to identify exactly where this is going to happen. But we see in verse 27, the people of Israel encamp before them like two little flocks of goats, but the Syrians filled the country. That's a very vivid image, and numbers-wise, it's right. I mean, you picture 7,000 men camping against 127,000 men, and they're outnumbered greatly. Who's going to win? Ask your kids. Who's going to win this fight? Well, God himself will give that answer. Because the Syrians have said, so their pride, their boasting against God, therefore I will give all this great multitude into your hand, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. So because Syria boasted against God, again, his judgment comes upon them. And the Israelites win the fight, outnumbered 127,000 to 7,000, and they win that fight. And it's almost 20-1, but they win. Ben-Hadad flees, he hides, and his servants seek to make peace. Surrender, really. They've heard that the kings of Israel are merciful, which is interesting. I'm not sure where they got that one from, but they've heard that, and so they do the signs of grieving, sackcloth and ropes on their head, which is also a sign of servitude there. So it's both a grief thing, but a surrender thing as well. And so they're going to come to Ahab, and Ahab lets him live. He lets the king go under the establishment of a covenant that will give Ahab back what is his, and also allow him to set up business in Damascus to continue to expand Israel's fortunes. Then we get the last part about a prophet. One of the prophets, sounds like a different one from before, is instructed by Yahweh to, in a way, deceive Ahab, but teach Ahab a judgment that is upon him. And so first he's told to have someone else hit him, so wound him, but the other man refuses. The prophet then judges that man, speaks God's condemnation of him because he refused to do God's word. We should assume that the other man was a fellow prophet, or had heard God's speaking to this prophet, that this is the word of Yahweh. The command of Yahweh was made known to him, and he did not listen. So he is struck down himself. He finds another man, tells him to strike him, and he does, and he's wounded. So he's able to disguise himself and be hurt. He puts a bandage over his eyes so he looks like he's been blinded in the battle. And he gives the king, Ahab, as he passes by on the road, he gives him this story about how he was out in the field, he was out as part of the battle, he was given another man to guard. Watch over this one. If something happens to him, that happens to you. If he dies, you die, basically, is the picture. And the prophet, in his disguise, says, he got away. I don't know what became of him. I lost him. So Ahab speaks and says, so shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. So Ahab tells him, you have earned your own fate. You had a job to do. You failed to do it. You have to suffer the consequences of that. The prophet then reveals himself and turns it all back on him. You had a job to do, King Ahab. God delivered Ben-Hadad into your hands for destruction, and you didn't do it. So God will now bring that upon you. This is not the only time a prophet does something like this, pulling a trick on him to bring about that judgment. I think of Nathan with King David and Bathsheba, that account where he tells him the sob story of the man and his sheep. And then when David condemns that man to death in the story as a king giving judgment, Nathan turns it on him and reveals it's you. You are the man. And we see something very similar to that going on in the text here. So we listen to what Yahweh says. We're called to do whatever the Lord gives us to do. Could be a good chance to talk to your kids about what God has given us to do as His church today. Just to love God, to love our neighbor, and talk about what that looks like.